Hello, everyone. I want to talk a little bit more about formative assessment and feedback because they're really, really, really important. And I just have a few things that I want to share. So I've got PowerPoint. I know. I don't do this very often. That's how important this is. So my first question is, are you ready? Make sure you've got a pen and paper. If you need to, pause this so you can go get that. Make sure you know how to take a screenshot. So if there's something where you want a copy of that whole slide, you could easily just screenshot it. You could do that by literally taking a picture with your phone, but you can also use, well, at least this is true on a Mac. I'm not sure if it's true everywhere, but I can do like I push all at once, Command, Shift, and then the number 4 all together. And it gives me a little box that I drag to take a screenshot. So that might be a way you could do this, but I definitely think there are going to be a few things, at least on here, where you're going to want to have notes, you're going to maybe want to have screenshots. And what are you going to do with these notes you take and these screenshots? Well, you're going to put them into your personal pages under the challenge that includes formative assessment and feedback. Because if you just keep everything on that personal page, you'll never have to ask, like, where is that? Where's that thing that I did in the summer that now I need? And it's November. So that's our plan. So let's see what's so important. So, of course, some pre-questions. Here are my pre-questions for you. Like literally, think of the answer in your head. In a recent study, how much more information did students who answered pre-questions retain than those who did not? What percentage? And then my next question is, how much more did immediate review questions help students retain? Again, I'm looking for a percentage. Just jot it down on the side somewhere. This is a very meta question. I realize that. It's a pre-question about pre-questions. So eventually you'll get the answers to those, and one of them is on the screen. So I want to talk about just pre-assessment for a minute. I know we're talking about formative assessment and feedback, but as long as I had you here and we're in this assessment vein, I thought I would talk a little bit about pre-assessment. There are basically 3 types. One would be very formal, a way for you and your students to get a sense of where they're at prior to a new unit of study so that you can tailor that unit. And for some of you, you may have in another course with me have created a pre-assessment using AI. AI is very good at creating those types of pre-assessments, and they're very useful. Now you could do a little pre-assessment that's a warm-up at the beginning of class. Maybe it's just like, students do a Kahoot or something where they're making guesses, or maybe in writing. Maybe they're doing it in small groups, standing at whiteboards. All kinds of ways you could do it as a warm-up. Because what we know, and this is insane, is that if you give students pre-questions prior to engaging with a resource, like a reading or video or a lecture or anything, you get 49% better recall. 49%. That's crazy. They make such a huge difference that you've noticed I use them almost every single assignment. And I'm trying to help you see how important they are, that is. And I'm hoping that as you've been doing them, you've started to get a sense of like why they work. Okay, so pre-assessments, very, very important. Here's some more pre-questions. It's just so meta. So which do you feel are more important, formative assessments or summative assessments, and why? I think maybe I asked you this question in the Perusal quiz, but I'm not sure. I'll let you think for a minute. And then of all the things you do to promote learning, where would you place formative assessment and feedback? Kind of in the middle, one of the less important things you do, one of the more important things that you do. So take a moment, maybe on a scale of 1 to 10, write down a number. And then as I talk, eventually you'll see the answer. So let's just define formative assessment, just to make sure everyone remembers that formative assessments are quick checks for understanding in the middle of things. So if you do it at the end of something, it's not a formative assessment. It's got to be done in the middle when things could still change. But a check for understanding is kind of a synonym for formative assessment. And they are so that I get a feeling for what students are understanding and students get a sense of what they know and they don't know. So most of your assignments in Perusall have a check for understanding at the end. Why? Well, again, for 2 reasons. So that you can see, oh, I thought I knew that and I didn't. Maybe I should check on that. So you're getting a sense of what you know and don't know. And I can look at your answers and also get a sense of what you know and don't know. But here's the wild thing. This is going to take me a moment to explain. But basically, there's this guy named John Hattie. If you've never heard of him before, eventually you probably will because he's extremely famous in the field of education. And here's what he's famous for. He does meta-analysis of meta-analyses, which means he looks at probably over 100 different factors that affect learning. He does them kind of one at a time, and he takes all of the research, like this, he's got this massive pile of research. So for example, formative assessment. He was like, okay, who has studied formative assessment? And what did they find? So he has a huge team, I'm sure. They gather all the research. It could be thousands of studies, who knows? They gather all this research on formative assessment. And then they throw out any of the research that isn't good quality. It has to meet their level of quality. And then they have this complex mathematical way of figuring out how important that particular thing is. So they're looking at, like I said, over 100 different things that could affect student learning. One of them might be formative assessment. One might be feedback, as you can see here. That helps them rank things. Like, here's the thing that makes the biggest difference in student learning. Here's what makes the second biggest. Here's what makes the third biggest. Yeah, they're able to rank 100 or more different things in terms of how important they are, how great the return on investment is. Like if I put my time into this in my classroom, how much will it help? And as you can see from this page, numbers 2, 3, and 5 all have to do with formative assessment and feedback. They are among the most important things you can possibly do in your classroom that are going to make the biggest difference overall. You might be wondering what number 1 is. It's something that's a little obscure and mostly only used in science classrooms. And at the moment, I can't remember what it is. I think it's called maybe like concept analysis. At any rate, you can go look it up. But suffice it to say, 2, 3, and 5 all have to do with formative assessment and feedback because it's so important. Now, when we're talking about feedback, a lot of people might imagine that we're talking about just praising students. That's feedback, right? Like, good job, go you. Now, those are almost worthless in terms of learning. Does that mean you shouldn't do it? No, you should definitely give students praise. But 2 things. 1, know that if all you're doing is saying like, that's great, go you, wonderful, it's going to help you build a better relationship with the students. It's not going to help them learn. And a relationship is important, so that is good. But if you give them specific praise, which means you did this well, and here is why, here's exactly what you did well, it goes from being almost worthless to being one of the most valuable things you can do, which makes sense. I mean, like, me telling you good doesn't really do much for helping you, like what part was good, what exactly about it should I try to repeat in the future. So Hattie's advice, the man that has looked at all the things that affect learning, he says, if you do nothing else, provide, and these are his words, and I love them, provide great dollops of specific high quality feedback. And every time I read that, it makes me think of a big dollop of whipping cream. So I put that picture here. So what are you trying to do with formative assessment? What does it accomplish? Well, right away, like in the moment, it helps you decide how to modify instruction. Like if you do a quick check for understanding and a lot of students aren't understanding, oh, I can stop and reteach or do something. Anytime you have a formative assessment, it gives you an opportunity for feedback. Feedback is also incredibly important. And it also helps students figure out if their learning tactics are working. Like if you give them a quiz over a chapter, just a check for understanding may not count for anything, and a student sees that they did really badly on it, they might think to themselves, I'm not sure I'm really understanding what I'm reading. I might need some help figuring out how to do that better. But over the long term, if you're doing a lot of formative assessment, you start to realize, oh, year after year, students struggle with this particular concept. I probably need to rethink how I teach that particular concept. And generally, it starts to then reveal strengths and weaknesses in your teaching. Like, oh, students are consistently doing well on this, and they're consistently doing poorly on that. Okay, that's really useful information for me to have. When you think about formative assessment, it's a spectrum. It goes from informal, meaning something that might take a few seconds to a few minutes to do. You could just maybe even do it on the fly. Like if students had little mini whiteboards, you could ask a quick question and have them hold up their whiteboards. These informal formative assessments are rarely graded. And then, so that's one end of the spectrum. And all the way at the other end would be formal formative assessments, which would maybe take longer. They might have what's called a learning artifact, like there's something a student could hand in. It could be graded. And oftentimes these formal assessments combine learning and assessment into a single activity. So for example, if you have groups of students in threes at work, whiteboards, working problems, they're learning, right? You're doing this so they learn, but you're also able to watch what they're doing and figure out what they're understanding and not understanding. So the learning and the assessment are happening at the same time with the same activity. Now, I keep using these two words, formative assessment and feedback. They're really two sides of the same coin. So it is possible to conduct a formative assessment and not provide any feedback to students, but it would be weird. For example, if you gave students a quiz and collected it and then never told them how they did, you could, sure, but why would you? Because yes, it is important that you know how they're doing. And when you collect the quiz, you could see that, but it's only if you return it or tell them what the right answers are that they then actually know for themselves. Because remember, that's what's important, is not just that you see how they're doing, but that students know how they're doing. So here's an interesting thought experiment for you. And you may want to pause the video to think about this. What would happen if you had loads of formative assessments and feedback, but never had any summative assessments? So like you never gave a big test, you never had these like major projects. What would happen? And then what would happen if you did the opposite? If you had only like those big summative things that happen at the end, like a test, like a project, but no formative assessments with feedback leading up to them? Like if you could only do one or the other, which would it be? I'm about to tell you the answer, so pause if you need to. I would say if you only did the first one, students would learn a lot. There's no huge need for summative assessments. Whereas if you only had summative assessments, students might that whole time leading up to it have no idea how they're doing and be freaking out. So if you could only have one or the other, formative assessments and feedback are way more important than summative. And with summative, I never give tests in any of my graduate courses or the courses I teach to first-year students. I do like projects, but with projects, you still would have tons of, like you'd be watching students as they worked on the projects and giving them feedback all along, doing little formative assessments. So it kind of, you start to, like, is a project really a summative assessment? I would say I would call it a summative assessment if you like give students the project and never check in on them. You're like, do it at home. I hope it turns out well. That would be a summative assessment. If you have them working on it continuously in class and you're giving them feedback, I'm not even sure I would call it a summative assessment. It's really kind of like a formative assessment that ends up at the end with a big project they can turn in. Never thought about that before. So what if feedback is kind of everything? Because really the main point of formative assessment is that they provide feedback. And anytime we make learning visible to us, because students are doing something we can look at, feedback becomes possible. And I will note that a difficult thing is that when you're face-to-face, feedback can be pretty heavy because you're constantly with students and watching them do things and can give them feedback in the moment. Whereas like in an asynchronous course online, feedback is extremely difficult because there isn't that like daily opportunity to be just like constantly providing this feedback. Basically, what I'm saying is feedback really is kind of everything. And it should be kind of foremost in your thinking every day. Like, how can I give more feedback? This is the most important slide in this slide deck. So I've put a little picture there that says attention, important information. Because my concern is that when teachers hear me say that feedback is one of the most important things, what they picture is that they, as the instructor, have to be the person who gives all that feedback. This is not true. There are lots of ways people can get feedback and give feedback. And I want you to use all of them because you will run yourself ragged if you are the one who's providing all the feedback. Let's look at all the possibilities here. Yes, you as the instructor can give feedback. You can give it in person as you're just roaming through the classroom and looking at what students are doing. Something that I think a lot of people don't realize they can do, but it's a lot of fun, is like if you're at home looking at student projects or reading students writing, you can just record your thoughts in an audio file and send it to the student as an email attachment. I'm telling you, my students just love the audio feedback, often so much more than the written feedback. Yeah, so I'm just saying, give it a try. And then, of course, you could give written feedback. But think more about how peers could give one another feedback, because that's really big. Can be really, you have to teach them how to do it. Otherwise, peers either just, oh, everything's great, all good, or sometimes they're little jerks about it. You don't want either. Both of those are bad. But even students just using checklists, like, does my partner have all the different parts of this project that are supposed to be there? You can get students to rank several things, like these are the 5 things that were supposed to happen in this piece of writing. Which would you say they did best? Which would you say they did second best? Kind of forces them to not be like, everything's perfect. Students can do a lot of self-feedback. So for example, when I showed you some examples of some students in the class who had particularly impressive personal pages, that allowed you to do some self-feedback, because you could look at what you were doing and you could look at what I said was good quality work, an example of good quality work, and you could be like, how does mine match up? So that you were able to give yourself self-feedback. You could use experts. So for example, it's really fun to get maybe students at your school who are older and more experienced to come into your class and give advice and feedback to students who are younger and less experienced. You could bring in a friend who, like, maybe you have a friend you're a scientist and your friend works in a field of science and that person comes in and gives feedback. That'd be cool. Technology, of course. All those quizzes that I give you, all the checks for understanding, for some of them that have just like a straight up right answer, when you're doing the check for understanding, you get like immediate feedback, right? It either says, yes, you got that right, or no, you didn't get it right. That would be technology providing feedback. And of course, now we have AI, which is remarkably good at giving feedback. So for example, I've had you do some kind of role play things with the AI, and where it would ask you questions, and then you would answer, and then it would give you feedback. So again, you're getting feedback from the AI. You can put in whole things. Like if you've created a lesson plan and you want some feedback on it, you can literally just attach it in AI and say, please give me some feedback on how I could improve this lesson plan. And you can put student writing in. I think as long as you tell students that you're doing it, like, I put your essay through an AI and asked it for feedback, and here's what it gave me. You could use that. You could give that to students when you hand back their work. Like, here's what AI said, and then here's what I'm adding on to that. Yeah, like doubles or triples the amount of feedback a student is getting with very little extra effort on your part. And of course, there's what I would call low-tech tech. So for example, if you have students using flashcards, they're getting feedback, like they look at the question, they try to answer it. That's the formative assessment. And then they flip it over, and either they got it right, or they got it partially right, or they got it wrong, but that's feedback, right? Yeah. So, or sometimes I have students write questions in one column and the answers in the next column, and they cover up and then kind of reveal them one by one. Anytime you have students, like take a quiz, they get feedback as long as you tell them what the right answers are. Yeah, there's so many ways that you can pack a course with feedback other than you thinking you are endlessly having to take things home and grade them, which is actually some of the least effective feedback. So in a moment, I'm gonna have you pause this video. I just told you 7 places that feedback could come from. And I want you to try to remember what they are, because as you recall, it drastically increases your retention of this idea if you do a quick self-quiz. So you're going to pause, try to come up with all 7, and then you can maybe run the video back a little and use those notes to check yourself. Okay, so pause now. All right, I hope you did well on that, and I hope you really did it. Did you not? Were you like, I'm not going to pause and do this? Nope. Stop and pause it. Okay. So that was an immediate post question. I taught you something, and then I immediately asked you to try it to see how well you remembered it. How much does that help learning? How much do you think it increases student retention? I asked you this question at the very beginning. Here's the answer. It increases retention and recall about 14%. Now, compared to the 49% of pre-questions, you're probably like, oh, that's nothing. No, 14% is huge. 14% is a letter and a half grade. So don't be thinking that that's a small thing. It's still big. It just doesn't seem huge in relationship to the pre-questions, but it's huge. Very few things that we do in education increase a score anywhere near that amount. It's usually much smaller. So pre-questions, extremely important. Immediate post-questions, very important. So I want to just think for a moment, like what ideas are starting to bubble up? What are you starting to think now about how you could incorporate more formative assessment and feedback? You may want to, this might be a good place to pause again and just like get some ideas down before you forget them. As I said, I just wanted to follow up on this, the idea that giving audio feedback can be really, really important, really kind of fun. Students tend to listen to it better. And then also, I just wanted to note that that whole thing where you might like take some student work and a red pen and just write all over it, that is not good. Much better to choose a few key things that you want students to focus on that would make the biggest difference to the quality of their work rather than marking every little problem. And in fact, if you're using AI to give students feedback, maybe the prompt you put in should be something like, what would be the 3 biggest things that this student could do to improve on X, Y, and Z? So that you're getting important feedback as opposed to a vast quantity of feedback. You want it to be high quality, small in number, as opposed to the whole kitchen sink. Quick review. I just want to see if you remember when you should give positive feedback and when you should give negative feedback. Again, if you're using AI to give students feedback, you might want to specify, like only give positive feedback or only give negative feedback, or what I would call critique. So do you remember when you do which? Because I'm about to give you the answer. So you give positive feedback when a student is just learning to do something and feels maybe a little insecure about it. So like if a student is writing memoir and you know they're anxious about their writing, don't be jumping in to give a whole bunch of negative feedback. Praise what they're doing well, tell them to do more of that, because you need them to have buy-in and start to feel good about what's happening and feel like they've got some confidence. Then you could start, once someone has some confidence and are starting to do well, you could then start giving them more critique. And you can even ask students, because just by nature, there seem to be some people who are like, yes, please, for the love of God, just give me a whole bunch of critique. I want it, I can take it. And others who it's just a lot, it takes a lot longer before they feel ready for that. A few guidelines for when you are giving feedback. I like to ask students where they think they need to improve. That way, if they list a few things that were on my list, I could be like, okay, they already know that. They already know that. Yay, I don't have to say those. And then you could focus on the things that they didn't notice that they needed to improve on. And here are some phrases that I like to use when I'm giving critique. Critique should never feel, I don't know, like harsh or angry. So here are some phrases that encourage critique, but in a kind way. So for example, this is looking good. Next, I'd like it to challenge you to, or to take it to the next level now, try this. Or the 2 things that I think would be most likely to move this from good to great are. See how all of those push students to do something more, but in a way that is supportive. Finally, I just want to talk for a brief moment about what the characteristics of a great quiz are, because quizzes are a very common way that we do formative assessment in the classroom. And quizzes can be, they're good. I mean, you know, there's a lot of good things to say about quizzes if they are done well. What would that look like? So think for a minute, what would be the difference between a quiz that was designed to help students understand where they are and what they need to do next versus one that was just designed to be evaluative? Think about that for a moment. Because what you want is more of the first one, that it really helps students understand where they are and what they need to do next, rather than just gives them a grade. Here's my ideas for improving quizzes. First of all, make sure students know what the purpose of the quiz is. If they feel it's just for you to put another grade in your grade book or for you to get something out of it, they're not going to participate in the same kind of way as if they realize that you're trying to do it to help them. Consider a quiz that it would be like, I call it 3 pens. 3 pens is when students take a quiz in one color ink, like black or blue, and then you hand out green pens and students get to work in small groups and they can change their answers. And then sometimes I go to the next stage and hand out purple pens, and then students can look up the answers like in a book or online or whatever. So they really feel, so everyone has a 100 at the end, right? But students can see and you can see what they actually knew versus what they came to know. Consider self-grading, like that students take a quiz and then you say, okay, grade your own quiz. What did you get on number 1? What did you get on number 2? Here's the right answer. Just in case you don't already know this, you should never have students swap and grade, because that is a FERPA violation. And it could be really embarrassing to students. I think oftentimes we think a quiz has to be something really, I don't know, like it would take a while for you to put together. When sometimes a quiz can just be, okay, it's the end of the period. It's the beginning of the period. Tell me what you know about, like, just tell me everything you know about, and then ask them to write about what they learned that day or what they learned the day before. It's nice to be able to go over the answers immediately. You can also try, this is kind of fun, if you are giving a more formal quiz, to do, again, this is best if you're not using it for a grade, to have 5 questions and they get increasingly difficult, so students can get a sense of how far they're able to get. It's a little cruel if you're using it for a grade, because that last question could be one you think only about 10% of the class is going to be able to answer. But if students see it as helping them see how far they're getting and kind of like fun, like trivia, they're going to do better. And then finally, have students reflect and set goals for how to do better, after each quiz. My final slide. I think when we're thinking about formative assessment and feedback, your best bet is always going to be to have students working on things like they would in the thinking classroom environment. And you are going around and just constantly watching students and saying things to them. I mean, this is kind of like the ideal type of feedback, like a art studio, like a science lab, workshop classes. Those are all very ideal because you're just constantly moving through the room and giving feedback, and you tend to walk away with a much stronger sense of who knows what. So I think your goal should be, how can we make all classes more similar to a studio, to a lab, to a workshop, where students are doing and you are mingling and giving feedback? All right. I know this was a little long. Thank you for hanging in there with me. And I hope you will go back and maybe look at certain slides, do whatever you need to do to get the good ideas from here into your personal pages where they can benefit you later. I guess I need to stop share and say goodbye.